Hi, and welcome back to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to continue learning the 1 to 4 player game Gloomhaven, Jaws of the Lion, designed by Isaac Childress and published by Cephalofair Games, who helped sponsor this video. The rules to this game were introduced over the first 5 scenarios, and in this video, we're going to look at the new things found in Scenario 2. So if you haven't already, be sure to check out the instructional video we have for Scenario 1, which you'll find links to in the description below. But with that in mind, join me at the table and let's continue learning how to play. Here we'll be setting up the next scenario by turning to its pages in the scenario book, and you'll follow the same steps as before with just a couple of changes that we'll go over together. Though first, I should mention when setting up the map, we don't add any monsters to the area below this line here. And we'll see why that is a little bit later. First, notice there are some new symbols in the scenario key. These are new tokens that we'll be adding to the map representing damage traps, treasure tiles, and money tokens. Where they go will be shown on the map like this, so just put the tokens on those matching spaces. Also, anywhere you place a trap, add one of these value 3 damage tokens on top. And we'll learn all about these new tokens in a moment. But notice that although I said monsters are not set up below this line, any other tokens or objects can be. It'll look something like this when you're done, and also notice we're using the Vermling Raiders again. But now, in addition to their standees and initiative token, which you'll take from their bag, you also need to collect the 4 cards labeled as basic Vermling Raiders, which you'll shuffle into a face-down pile. Also, don't forget, at the end of the last scenario, each player replaced 2 of their ability cards labeled as A with 2 new ones labeled as B. Now let's move on and talk about some of these new tokens, like this one. It's a money token, and some will start the game on the map, but also, anytime a monster dies after it's removed from the board, they drop a new money token which you take from the supply and put in the space that they were removed from. Anytime a character ends their turn on a space with one of these tokens, they automatically loot it. It is taken from the board and then put on their character mat. The important thing is that you must end your turn on a space with a money token in order to loot it. You can't just pass over it and pick it up that way. The exception is if their action includes one of these loot abilities. When this is resolved, you gain the coin in your space and on any of the spaces within the numbered range shown here. So I would also get to collect this coin and this one here, even though a monster is standing on its space. This here is a treasure tile, and it can be collected in the same ways as money, either by ending a turn on its space or by using the loot action. And once collected, you remove it from the board and put it back in the supply. But then check the number written in its space, 14 in this situation. You'll pull out the Gloomhaven glossary rulebook and then turn to its final page where you'll find this treasure index. And if you look up your revealed number, you'll discover your reward, which in this case was to gain 3 money tokens, which you then take from the supply. Money and treasure that are not looted by the end of the scenario are lost. In other words, you don't automatically get the leftovers that are on the map just by winning the scenario. So keep that in mind. If there's something you want to pick up, you'll have to do it before the scenario ends. This here is a trap token, and any figure, whether it's a character or monster, that enters its space will suffer 3 damage, as you're reminded of here, and then the trap is returned to the supply. Traps do not, however, end your movement. If the figure still had more spaces to go, it can continue after taking the damage. We also have a new type of space as shown with this outline known as a door. Doors will help to separate different rooms in a scenario. So we have a room area up here and one down here. This is why during the setup we didn't add monsters to this bottom area, because it's a separate, unrevealed room. You should also keep in mind that door spaces are considered walls when checking line of sight, and monsters can't enter them. However, once a character enters a space with a door for the first time, it is automatically opened, and you place one of these tokens here to show this. That space is now considered open for characters and monsters to move into and through. But you now pause at this time and set up all monsters in the new room, which is referred to as revealing the room. With the new area set up, the player who revealed it continues their turn, which might include finishing a move they were resolving when they entered the door space. Alright, so that's the new information about the layout of this scenario, along with looting and some things that affect movement. But there are also some new actions and symbols that we need to learn about here, so let's discuss those next. First off, you might have noticed these small attack and move symbols on all of your ability cards, but we didn't use them in the first scenario. Well, now you can. These are called basic actions, and instead of using the abilities on the top or bottom of any card, you will now have access to an Attack 2 as an alternative top action, or Move 2 as an alternative bottom action. And when performing either of these basic actions, you completely ignore everything else on the card. Here's a new symbol that you might encounter with some actions, and this means that if you perform that related action, afterwards, instead of discarding this card, you will send it directly to your lost pile. If you don't want to lose the card, you can just use its basic action instead, which ignores the rest of the card's effects, including that lost symbol. Or as always, you can just skip that action entirely. You may also find some new cards with symbols like this, which indicate that they are area effects. In other words, they target all of the monsters in the red hexes shown. If you see a gray hex, that represents the one your character is currently in, and it means the attack will be considered a melee attack against enemy targets in the spaces represented by red hexes. Though I should mention, it will not hurt friendly figures who might happen to be in those spaces as well. Also, when looking at the board, this arrangement of hexes can be rotated in any way you like, just as long as the shape shown here doesn't change. In other words, if there were two enemies in these positions, they can also be targeted by this area effect. Sometimes an area effect will not have a gray hex, but instead specify a range. And only one of the hexes that make up this area need to be in range of the figure causing the effect. And the target hex doesn't even have to have a figure in it. This will still allow the entire area to be affected by the ability, which in this case is an attack with a base damage of 3. The only restriction is that you must have line of sight to an enemy within the area in order to be able to damage it. And again, friendly figures in any of the target spaces are not affected. So here's an example where maybe my figure is using this attack in order to target this space here, which is a range of 2 away. And they have line of sight to this space. Now looking at this arrangement of hexes, that means all of these hexes here can be targeted by the attack. And each enemy there will suffer a separate attack of 3 damage except for this one, because I can't draw a line of sight from my character to the one here because of the walls between us. Remember, walls will have a double-lined border. But these two here I can draw a line of sight to through the open door. And don't forget, you draw a separate attack modifier card from your deck for each of them. Also note that even with a ranged area effect attack, you still gain disadvantage against any of those targets that are in spaces directly adjacent to you. Another effect you may have is a push or a pull, and each will have a number indicating how many hexes your target will be moved. With a push, your target is forced to move up to that number of spaces away from you, and each space it enters must put it farther away from you. Sometimes it won't be possible to move further away, in which case it will just stop moving. With pull, it works the same way, except each space the target moves must bring it closer to you. As the person causing the push or pull, you otherwise decide the direction and even distance that the target goes up to its maximum. But if you want, you can move it fewer spaces. Also keep in mind, the target can still move through its own allies as usual, but never through its enemies, obstacles, or walls. And a really clever way to use this effect is if you can move an enemy onto a trap, which will cause it to trigger and then cause that target to suffer damage. Now sometimes a monster will have a push or pull ability, but if so, the players will decide the direction that their character is moved, but the target must always be pushed or pulled the full allowable amount. This scenario also introduces a new condition as well called Disarm, and as explained here, it means that the affected figure cannot perform any attack abilities, and then the token will be removed at the end of that figure's next full turn. In this scenario and all future ones, you now have a new technique for canceling incoming damage, whether it's from a monster, trap, or any other source. Let's say, for example, a monster attacked you and they had a base damage of 3, and then they drew this ×2 modifier, making it a total of 6. Well, that's a lot of damage, and you might not survive it. Well, now, you can either place 1 card from your hand directly into your lost pile, or any 2 cards from your discard pile into your lost pile to cancel all that incoming damage. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that any cards you pick to play during the turn, if they haven't been resolved yet, well, they'll still be on the table. So those aren't in your hand or in your discard pile, so they can't be used to negate damage with this effect. Okay, well now it's time to talk a bit more about the monsters, because in this scenario, they aren't as predictable as they were before. So let's go back to the table and I'll show you what I mean. During card selection, after players have revealed their 2 cards for the round, you flip over the top card of the ability decks for each monster in play. Here we only have Vermlings, so there's just one deck. And this card will be for all of the Vermling Raider figures. Instead of their initiative always being 50, like it was in the first scenario, it will now be whatever value is showing here. So based on the numbers that we're displaying, it means the Vermling Raiders will act after Hatchet, but before the Demolitionist. This card will also list all of the abilities that each Vermling will resolve during their turns. At the beginning of each new round, you'll then reveal a new card from this deck, and eventually you'll find one with a symbol that looks like this. If so, then at the end of that round, you reshuffle all of that monster's cards into a new deck that you'll continue drawing from. Now, the interesting thing about these cards is that in addition to telling you what actions each monster will take, as listed here, they also modify the normal values for those actions. For example, when it would get to the Vermling Raider's turn in this round, as you activate each one, first they would push all adjacent enemies one space away, and then they would follow that with a range 2 attack of +1. This means you take their normal attack value and modify it by the +1, creating a base of 3. And then of course they would still draw a card from their modifier deck and adjust it further. The important thing to understand is that a monster will only perform the abilities listed on its revealed card. If it doesn't say move, then the monster won't move. If it doesn't say attack, then the monster won't attack. Some of the monster abilities will have a ranged value with their attacks, and if they're also moving, then the monster will only move as many spaces as required to get within range of its focus. But it will also move away from its target to avoid disadvantage. For example, let's say the Vermling had started here. If it had a movement of 2 and let's say a range of 3, it's already in range of its focus here, so it doesn't need to move, except that it has disadvantage because it's adjacent to its target. So we would then move to here, and that way still be in range, but no longer have disadvantage. Now the exception would be if the monster already had disadvantage from something else, let's say the muddle condition. In that case, it would gain no benefit from moving away, so it will just stay put and do its ranged attack from here. The special rules we're talking about here for monster movement only apply to ranged attacks. If the monster is doing a melee attack or no attack at all, then it will instead just move in an attempt to get adjacent to the character that has its focus. If you want more examples of monster movement and focus, open to page 26 and 27 of the glossary and look these pages over to help reinforce your understanding of how these rules work. Another thing to keep in mind is that we have traps on the board. So if a monster is moving, it will take traps into consideration when determining focus. In other words, it will always try to find a path that doesn't take it into a trap unless that's the only choice. For example, in this case, the Vermling has a movement of 1 and it wants to do a melee attack which will have a value of 2. Technically, Hatchet is the closest target, but it can only attack Hatchet by moving onto one of these traps. So the Demolitionist becomes its focus instead. On the other hand, if the Vermling had a ranged attack of 2, it wouldn't need to enter a trap space, so it would stay focused on Hatchet. Something else to remember about this scenario is that we have 2 separate rooms. And so if you start a round and there are no monsters in the room where your characters are located, then you don't flip a card for them because there aren't any to activate. Once a room has been revealed and the monsters added to it, if one of their abilities hadn't been flipped that round, then you flip it now. And if the initiative showing is lower than the character who revealed the room, the Vermlings will act as soon as that character's turn is finished, and you'll show this by putting their token next in the initiative order. However, if their value is higher than the player who just revealed the room, then they will activate when it gets to their initiative number in the turn order as usual. With that, you now know everything you need to play this second scenario, but there are still 2 things we should talk about. One is what happens after you lose a scenario, and the other are the rules for after this scenario is complete, because now you'll be able to go shopping with the money that you looted. First things first though, let's say you didn't complete the goal and instead lost the scenario. In that case, you reset the scenario and try again. But all money tokens that you collected will carry over with you into your next attempt. Let's say I had these 3 coins, I'd keep them, but everything else for my character would reset as well as on the scenario, except for treasure tiles. If they've already been looted and removed from the board, then they will not return when you retry the scenario again. If you're having a lot of trouble beating a scenario, first of all, make sure you're playing the rules correctly, but also there is a way to make things a little easier. At the start of a new attempt of a scenario, feel free to rotate the monster stat card in the envelope so that a 0 is showing here. These monsters will no longer be quite as challenging, which might be just the break that you need. Now though, let's assume you did complete scenario 2. What happens? Well, first of all, remember that a scenario doesn't end until the very end of the round in which you completed the goal. So if some figures haven't taken their actions yet, make sure they do, because this can be a good time to pick up any last-minute loot. Remember, anything you didn't collect will be lost, even if you win the scenario. As usual, you'll read the conclusion text and gain the rewards listed with it. Here it says to reveal the new black ship location. So on the map, check off the scenario you just completed and then add this new sticker to it. Each player should also record how much gold they have. Every money token that you collect is worth 2 gold each. So in this case, I collected a total of 10 gold. But the scenario also rewards each player with 25 gold. So I personally now have a total of 35, which I then record here in the gold notes of my character sheet. The money tokens you collected during the scenario can now be returned to the supply. And keep in mind, players may not share gold or money tokens at any time. We have one last reward to resolve here, and it's the opening of the item shop. From now on, after every scenario, whether you succeed or not, characters may go to the shop. Find the cards with this back, and they'll have numbers here, and you'll pick out the ones numbered 1 to 13, and put the rest of them back in the box on this side of the divider that you see here. The cards we kept are known as the available items, and players can acquire any number of these by going through them and paying the gold cost shown here, reducing the gold on their sheet by the amount that they paid. A character can never have more than one copy of the same item, and each item also has a type as shown by this symbol here. There are head, body, feet, hand, and small items. As long as they're different, you can own as many of each type as you like, but when starting a scenario, you can only equip at most one of each type. The exception are hand items, because you can have up to 2 of those equipped at a time. Any items you own but choose not to equip, you can just return to your character box, and maybe you'll want to use those in a later scenario. Every item has a function as described here, and you can use those functions in addition to your normal 2 card actions for the turn. Now, some of the effects on these might be new to you, but don't worry, we'll go over them in the next video. However, the symbols here in the corner are important to understand, so let's go over these. This one here represents a spent icon. That means after using an item like this, you rotate it on its side, and it can't be used again until your character takes a long rest. And a long rest is something we'll learn about in the next video. Here's another symbol you might find on items, and this one means that once the item is used, it's consumed and cannot be used again during that scenario. To represent this, you just flip it over. Now, you don't actually lose the item. You will get this back the next time you're playing a new scenario, and you'll be able to flip it over to have it ready for use again. On the other hand, if you have an item that shows no symbol in the corner, this item is persistent, meaning its effect can be resolved any time it would apply during the scenario. Once all the players are finished making any purchases, sales, or trades that they want to, you'll return the remaining items you didn't buy back to the box on this side of the divider as a reminder that these items will be available the next time you go to the shop. Characters can also sell items they bought previously, returning them to the shop, and then collecting half the amount of gold that it originally cost, rounded up. And although I said you can't trade or give gold to other players, between scenarios, players can trade items or give items that they already purchased to other players. With the shopping done and the scenario complete, at the end of Scenario 2, players will now get their stored pack of ability cards from their personal box and find the first 2 labeled with a 1 here, and then add them to their current ability cards, bringing them to 8 ability cards total for use in the next scenario. Now you can save your game or continue with the 3rd scenario, and you'll find a link to the video for that in the description below. But otherwise, that's everything you need to know to play the 2nd scenario of Gloomhaven, Jaws of the Lion. If you have any questions about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notification anytime we post a new video. But until next time, thanks for watching.